Cold air spilled from the Cypress brake as deputies stepped closer, boots stopping where frost thinned to mud, a wallet pressed flat beside tire impressions, holiday tinsel snagged on reeds, and a stillness settled that felt measured, recorded, and final, as if the ground itself had decided to testify at last. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery came just after dawn on December 27, 1982, outside a small Louisiana town where highways narrowed into parish roads and the calendar moved slower than the rest of the country. The men who found the scene were accustomed to hunting leases and winter burns, not to evidence flags. They waited, watched breath turn white, and understood that whatever lay ahead would not move quickly. Louisiana winters do not roar, they linger. The cold is damp, the light gray, and the ground remembers pressure. When deputies arrived, they photographed before touching, measured before speaking, and marked impressions that would soon soften. The victim was a young woman, 22 years old, missing since Christmas Eve, identified by documents found yards away from where her body rested, positioned in a way that suggested concealment rather than accident. There were no signs of frenzy. There was organization, and that unsettled everyone present. The parish sheriff's office worked from a cinder-block building with fluorescent lights that hummed through power dips. Files were kept in steel cabinets, labels typed, edges browned by humidity. The case received a number, then a box. Initial observations were recorded without flourish. Clothing consistent with winter travel, no obvious defensive injuries, no weapon recovered. Time of death estimated within a narrow window based on temperature, lividity, and environmental exposure. The coroner noted subtle indicators that suggested restraint without visible trauma, a finding that would matter years later. The autopsy, conducted in a modest facility, documented fibers not native to the immediate area and a faint chemical odor that dissipated quickly. Blood alcohol was negligible. Toxicology was otherwise unremarkable. Cause of death was listed carefully, pending further review, with language that left room for future clarification. Her name was printed in the local paper 2 days later, below a photo taken the previous spring. She had grown up nearby, left briefly for school, and returned for the holidays with plans to start work in January. Missing person flyers, already curling on grocery store boards, were replaced by a short obituary that emphasized family, church attendance, and a quiet ambition. The community reacted with the particular silence that follows shock in small towns. Doors were locked earlier. Men checked the road before turning in. Women counted children twice. The sheriff addressed the press without speculation, stating only that the investigation would be thorough. The timeline began with Thanksgiving. She arrived home the week before, drove her own car, and stayed with relatives. Receipts showed modest purchases, seasonal and practical. On December 23, she mailed cards at the post office just off the square, a building with a flag that never seemed to rest. On Christmas Eve, she planned to attend a late service and then drive to a neighboring parish to meet friends. Her car was later found parked neatly near a closed gas station along a route she would have taken, doors locked, keys missing. There were no signs of struggle inside. The odometer matched expectations. Tire wear was even. Nothing appeared disturbed. The absence of chaos pointed investigators away from random violence and toward something quieter. Witness canvases followed procedure. A cashier remembered a young woman buying coffee earlier that evening. A patrolman recalled a vehicle idling near the station after midnight, but could not identify it. Weather records showed a cold snap uncommon for the area, temperatures dipping enough to preserve impressions overnight. Those impressions, photographed and cast, suggested a larger vehicle with tires not standard issue for compact cars. The casts were stored, labeled, and then forgotten as the months wore on. By New Year's, the case slowed. Leads thinned. The parish had limited resources, and the region had its share of unsolved disappearances that never became names beyond their families. The sheriff requested assistance from state investigators, who reviewed files, recommended additional interviews, and moved on. The evidence box gained weight but not clarity. Fibers were compared with known materials in local industries and returned inconclusive. The faint chemical note raised questions about cleaning agents common in certain workplaces, but nothing tied cleanly to a suspect. The cause of death remained classified with careful language that satisfied paperwork but not grief. Years passed. The file migrated from active to inactive, then to cold. The cabinet changed buildings, paper yellowed, officers retired. The town expanded slightly, then contracted. Christmas came and went, each year bringing a brief resurgence of interest, a short article reminding readers of an unanswered question. Families aged. Memory softened edges that facts could not. The case did not move again until the early 2000s, when a clerk reorganizing archives found the tire casts mislabeled among traffic materials. By then, databases had improved, and patterns could be revisited with fresh eyes. A retired detective, consulted informally, noted the neatness of the car and the absence of struggle as indicators of compliance, perhaps induced by familiarity or authority. The chemical odor, once dismissed, suggested a controlled environment. The fibers, re-examined with updated methods, were identified as consistent with a specific upholstery, used in a limited run of utility vehicles sold regionally in the early 1980s. Investigators rebuilt the timeline with patients learned from age. They mapped routes, compared payrolls, and reviewed who had access to vehicles matching the profile during the holidays, when schedules changed and oversight thinned. A name surfaced, then receded, then returned. He had worked seasonal shifts at a facility that closed for Christmas Eve, had access to cleaning supplies, and drove a vehicle matching the upholstery and tire pattern. In 1982, he had given a statement placing himself elsewhere, corroborated loosely by a coworker who later admitted uncertainty. That coworker had since died. The suspect had left the parish in the late 1980s, lived quietly, and avoided attention. When contacted decades later, he consented to an interview. Age had altered his appearance, not his habits. Records showed a minor arrest years earlier for an unrelated offense, during which a sample had been collected and stored under a different system. Advances in forensic genealogy and database integration allowed analysts to compare preserved material from the case with existing records. The match was not immediate, but it was persuasive enough to warrant a warrant. The evidence did not shout. It accumulated. Fibers aligned. Tire impressions matched manufacturing tolerances. The chemical residue corresponded to supplies from the suspect's former workplace. A re-examination of the autopsy, informed by contemporary standards, clarified the mechanism of death without dramatization. It described pressure applied in a manner consistent with restraint, brief and fatal, leaving little outward sign. The law required restraint in language and certainty in fact, and the file now met that standard. In December, nearly 40 years after the discovery, an arrest was made quietly. There were no sirens. The press gathered anyway, familiar with the rhythm of such moments. In court, the evidence was presented methodically. The defense tested timelines and questioned memory, but the material facts held. A jury deliberated without spectacle. The verdict came back with the steadiness of a long winter ending. The sentence reflected age and law, measured and final. The town marked the moment without celebration. A plaque was placed at the courthouse listing resolved cases, one more line added. At Christmas that year, candles burned a little longer. The file returned to its box, now labeled closed, the weight unchanged but the meaning different. The investigation, reopened with deliberation rather than urgency, moved forward by reconstructing the parish as it existed in late 1982, not as it appeared decades later. Roads were narrower then, signage sparse, lighting inconsistent. The gas station where the car had been left sat at a junction used mostly by locals who knew which pumps stayed unlocked after hours. Maps from the period showed seasonal detours caused by drainage work, altering traffic patterns during Christmas week. Investigators walked those routes again, noting where a vehicle could pause unseen, where headlights would be obscured by tree lines, and where winter rain pooled long enough to preserve impressions. Archived payroll records from regional employers were reviewed, not for alibis but for absences. Christmas Eve schedules were often informal, and supervisors signed off early. One facility, a small distribution warehouse outside town, closed at noon that day. Several employees left together, but one signed out late, citing cleanup duties. The warehouse inventory included industrial cleaners with solvent bases matching the faint odor described in the autopsy notes. Those notes, written with restraint, had mentioned the smell only once, almost as an aside. With modern context, that aside became a thread. The suspect's name appeared again in vehicle registrations from the era. He owned a utility vehicle purchased used in 1981, upholstery consistent with the fibers recovered. The tires, replaced in early 1983, matched the pattern cast from the scene. Service records showed the replacement occurred shortly after the holidays. At the time, that change meant nothing. Years later, it suggested awareness. Investigators did not assume motive. They documented sequence. Witness interviews were revisited, not to test memory but to confirm consistency. The cashier's recollection of coffee aligned with receipts. A neighbor remembered hearing a vehicle idle unusually long near the closed station after midnight, an annoyance dismissed then. Weather logs confirmed temperatures low enough to slow decomposition, explaining the condition of the body when found. Each fact fit without force. The case did not require leaps, only patience. The victim's movements were traced with care. Phone records were limited in 1982, but toll logs showed no long-distance calls after Christmas Eve afternoon. Her plans were modest, her route predictable. Investigators considered why she would stop where she did. The absence of fear suggested familiarity or authority. The suspect's employment placed him in uniform, often mistaken for official by locals, especially at night. That uniform, described in employment files, used synthetic fibers similar to those recovered. The reopened autopsy review was conducted by a different coroner's office with expertise in historical cases. The original findings were respected. New interpretation clarified pressure patterns without adding drama. The conclusion remained clinical. Death occurred within minutes. There was no prolonged struggle. This reinforced the theory of compliance followed by restraint. The law demands specificity, and the report provided it. Forensic genealogy did not dominate the case, but it supported it. A partial profile, degraded by time, matched through a chain of relatives until narrowed to the suspect. Legal thresholds were met carefully. Warrants were obtained with conservative language. When the interview occurred, it was recorded in full. The suspect denied involvement, offered an alibi that relied on memory rather than documentation. He did not request counsel immediately, a choice that allowed investigators to note inconsistencies without confrontation. Evidence linkage required corroboration beyond science. Investigators located the utility vehicle, long since sold, but records showed its transfer to a scrapyard in the early 1990s. The scrapyard logs, miraculously preserved, confirmed the upholstery type. Photographs from the yard showed tires of the same make as those replaced in 1983. The pattern repeated. Media coverage remained measured. Local papers avoided speculation, focusing on process. Older residents recognized names and places. Younger ones learned the town's past. The courthouse files, once cold, were requested again, their edges still browned. The judge assigned had grown up nearby, recused himself to avoid any appearance of bias. Another judge took the bench, procedure intact. The indictment was filed quietly in late November, close to Thanksgiving. Timing was not symbolic, but it felt appropriate. Families gathered while the community absorbed the news. The arrest followed without incident. The suspect was taken into custody at his residence, cooperative, silent. There were no images broadcast live, only a short notice printed the next morning. Pretrial motions tested the admissibility of decades-old evidence. The court ruled methodically, excluding nothing that failed standards and admitting what met them. The fibers were allowed. The tire evidence was contextualized. The genealogy was limited to supporting probable cause, not presented as sole proof. The case rested on convergence. Trial began in early December. The courtroom was modest, decorated with wreaths placed by staff, not parties. Jurors listened to timelines rather than theories. Experts explained without flourish. The defense suggested coincidence, questioned memory, emphasized the passage of time. The prosecution emphasized continuity, the way small facts aligned over years. There were no raised voices. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. The sentence reflected statutory limits and the defendant's age. It acknowledged harm without rhetoric. The judge spoke briefly, recognizing the family's endurance and the investigator's restraint. Appeals were noted, later denied. Afterward, the town returned to routine. Christmas services included a line in prayers, not names. The family marked the season privately. The sheriff's office updated its wall of closed cases, one more file resolved. The archives were reorganized again, this time with digital backups. The case became a reference point for training, an example of patience and preservation. It reminded younger investigators that notes matter, that asides can become anchors, that winter preserves more than ground. The parish did not change overnight. Roads remained narrow. The cold returned each December, but one question no longer lingered. In the months following the verdict, attention shifted from the courtroom to the administrative quiet that follows resolution. Records were finalized, exhibits cataloged for long-term storage, and the case status updated across state and federal systems. The sheriff's office issued a brief statement emphasizing the collective effort across decades, naming no individual as responsible for success. The language mirrored the investigation itself, precise, restrained, and complete. For a community accustomed to rumors filling gaps, the clarity was unfamiliar. The victim's family navigated a different landscape. Closure did not arrive as relief so much as a cessation of waiting. Holidays had long carried a weight that no calendar could lighten. Thanksgiving meals, once punctuated by an empty place setting, became quieter, then customary again. Christmas cards resumed their roots. The knowledge that the case was solved did not rewrite memory. It placed it somewhere finite. They requested no public memorial beyond the correction of records and the return of personal effects held since 1982. Those items, preserved with care, bore the marks of time but not of spectacle. Investigators conducted a post-case review to document lessons learned. The emphasis fell on preservation and humility. The mislabeling of tire casts, once a simple error, became a teaching point. So did the autopsy's understated note about odor, demonstrating how restrained observations can gain meaning later. The review highlighted the importance of weather logs, payroll records, and local maps, materials often overlooked in favor of more dramatic evidence. The conclusion was not celebratory, It was practical. The parish itself continued to age. Businesses changed hands. The gas station was demolished and replaced by a convenience store with bright lighting and cameras that never sleep. The warehouse closed, then reopened under different ownership, its records digitized. Roads were widened. Drainage improved. None of these changes altered the past, but they framed it differently. New residents learned of the case as history, not rumor. Legal finality arrived with the exhaustion of appeals. The sentence stood. The defendant entered the correction system with the anonymity of age. There were no further charges, no additional victims identified. The investigation had been careful not to imply patterns without evidence. That restraint held. The file remained singular, resolved on its own merits. Media interest faded as predictably as it had risen. Anniversary pieces grew shorter. The town's name returned to routine mentions. Yet the case lingered in professional circles as an example of how rural jurisdictions can succeed with patience and cooperation. Training seminars referenced it obliquely, focusing on method rather than outcome. The emphasis remained on lawful process. Winter returned each year with familiar signals. Cold fronts swept down from the north, bringing the same damp chill that had preserved impressions decades earlier. Deputies still patrolled parish roads, boots crunching on gravel where frost sometimes appeared. The land did not forget pressure easily. That understanding informed patrol practices and evidence handling, small adjustments that reflected institutional memory. The courthouse maintained its files with renewed diligence. Older boxes were scanned, labels standardized, access logs tightened. The clerk who had found the misfiled casts retired, satisfied that the discovery had mattered. New clerks learned to respect margins and notes, the places where facts hide. For the family, the quiet aftermath included practical matters. Estate documents were updated. A scholarship fund, considered and then declined, gave way to a simpler gesture, a donation to the parish library for archival supplies. The library accepted without ceremony. Preservation, they felt, was the appropriate legacy. The victim's name appeared once more in the local paper, not as a headline but as part of a year-in-review column noting the resolution of a long-unsolved case. The tone was factual. It listed dates and outcomes, avoided adjectives. Readers nodded, some remembering where they had been when the news first broke. Memory aligned briefly, then dispersed. Investigators who had worked the case across eras reflected privately on the passage of time. Careers had spanned analog and digital, paper and database. The case bridged those worlds. It demonstrated that technology aids but does not replace observation, that interviews conducted respectfully can outlast memory's erosion, that communities carry truths quietly until process invites them forward. The physical site of discovery returned to obscurity. Cypress grew thicker, seasonal flooding erased and redrew edges. No marker stood there. The land absorbed winter rains and summer heat alike. That absence of commemoration was intentional. The resolution belonged to records, not to places. The parish sheriff addressed deputies at an annual meeting, referencing the case without names. The message focused on continuity, on the obligation to document even when outcomes seem distant. He reminded them that future investigators inherit today's margins. The room listened, aware that such counsel was earned. As years passed, the case receded into archives accessible by request. Researchers examined it occasionally, noting the alignment of mundane facts. It resisted simplification. There was no single turning point, no dramatic confession. The solution emerged from accumulation. That characteristic made it less compelling to casual audiences and more valuable to professionals. The quiet aftermath extended to policy. The parish invested modestly in evidence storage, humidity control, and training. Grants were small, targeted. The improvements did not announce themselves. They simply reduced risk. Holidays continued to frame memory. Thanksgiving marked beginnings and returns. Christmas Eve carried the weight of choices and roots. New Year emphasized the slow turn from unresolved to resolved. These temporal anchors shaped how the case was remembered, not as an interruption but as a line that finally reached its end. The final accounting rested on verification. Each element of evidence could be traced, each conclusion supported. The law's requirement for certainty had been met without force. That satisfaction was quiet, professional, and enduring. In the end, the case altered little beyond itself. It did not transform the town or redefine justice. It demonstrated that even in places where time moves slowly, time does move, and with it the capacity to answer questions if records are kept and patience maintained. The community absorbed that lesson without comment, returning to routines shaped by seasons and roads, carrying forward a knowledge that winter preserves, and that eventually someone will look again. The final chapter of the case unfolded without ceremony, as most lawful endings do. Sentencing concluded, paperwork finalized, and custody transferred according to schedule. There were no statements read aloud beyond those required by statute. The courtroom emptied slowly, chairs scraping against tile, coats pulled on against the same winter air that had framed the beginning. Outside, the square looked unchanged. Traffic moved. Flags lifted and settled. The town absorbed the moment and continued. Administrative closure required precision. Evidence logs were signed, chain of custody forms archived, and biological samples marked for long-term retention under updated guidelines. The parish coordinated with state repositories to ensure future access for audit or review. Nothing was destroyed. The lesson of time weighed heavily. Digital copies were verified against originals. Metadata was checked. Redundancy was intentional. The sheriff's office conducted a final internal briefing, not to celebrate but to conclude. Each unit reported actions taken and materials submitted. The case status was updated across national databases, removing the victim's name from unresolved lists that had carried it for decades. That removal mattered. It corrected statistics and, more importantly, language. The record now reflected an answer rather than a question. Community response settled into a muted acknowledgement. There were no marches, no public vigils, no speeches. Older residents discussed it briefly at diners and feed stores, recalling where they had been during Christmas of 1982. Younger residents encountered it as a resolved headline, notable but distant. The difference marked the passage of time more clearly than any calendar. The family requested privacy and received it. They declined interviews and issued a short written note thanking investigators for persistence. The note emphasized process over outcome, acknowledging that no resolution restores what was lost. It asked only that the victim be remembered accurately, without embellishment. Local editors honored that request. In the months that followed, routine returned fully. Patrol shifts rotated. New cases arrived with their own demands. Yet the closed file influenced daily work subtly. Deputies took more photographs, wrote fuller notes, preserved small observations that once might have seemed inconsequential. The culture shifted incrementally, shaped by an understanding that patience is not passive. Training sessions incorporated anonymized elements from the case. Instructors emphasized how ordinary records become decisive years later. Payroll logs, weather reports, service receipts, and marginal notes were presented as equal partners to forensic science. The message resonated, particularly with older officers who recognized their own habits in the lessons. The courthouse maintained a quiet tradition after the resolution. On the anniversary of the verdict, the clerk placed a single line in the internal ledger noting the case's closure date. It was not displayed publicly. It existed for continuity, a marker for those who would come later and wonder how long the answer took. Seasonal cycles continued to frame memory. Thanksgiving arrived with familiar routines, meals measured and unremarked. Christmas Eve passed with services and early nights. New Year's came and went, marked by restraint rather than celebration. These holidays no longer carried an unanswered absence. They carried history. The land where the discovery occurred remained unmarked, reclaimed by vegetation and weather. Cypress roots spread. Water pooled and receded. No sign indicated what had happened there. That absence aligned with the family's wishes and the community's temperament. Memory resided in records, not monuments. Years later, a researcher requested access to the file for a study on cold case methodology. Permission was granted under supervision. The researcher noted the absence of theatrics, the steadiness of documentation, the reliance on cumulative facts. The case resisted simplification into narrative arcs. It stood as an example of resolution through alignment rather than revelation. The suspect's life concluded within the correction system, quietly and without further legal proceedings. Notices were filed. The sentence had been served as far as time allowed. The legal outcome remained intact. No posthumous claims altered the record. The case stayed closed. For the investigators who had shepherded the case across eras, retirement came and went. Some kept copies of training materials that referenced the file, not as souvenirs but as reminders. They understood that most work ends without recognition. This case, too, ended that way, despite its duration. The parish library cataloged donated archival supplies purchased with funds from the family. Acid-free boxes replaced brittle containers. Humidity controls were installed. These changes benefited countless records beyond the single case. Preservation became a shared value rather than a specialized concern. Local press occasionally referenced the case when discussing advancements in forensic review or archival management. The tone remained factual. There were no anniversary specials, no dramatizations. The editors chose restraint, mirroring the investigation's character. As decades layered over the resolution, the case became part of institutional memory. New deputies learned its outline during orientation, not as lore but as procedure. They learned that winter preserves impressions, that compliance can mask danger, that time tests documentation. They learned that answers may arrive long after the urgency fades. The final measure of the case rested not in emotion but in accuracy. Each conclusion could be traced to evidence. Each step adhered to law. The outcome did not depend on confession or spectacle. It depended on accumulation and verification. That standard endured. In quiet moments, the town acknowledged that something once unresolved had been resolved. It did not change daily life, but it removed a lingering uncertainty. That removal mattered in ways difficult to articulate. It allowed memory to settle. The calendar continued its steady turn. Roads widened further. New buildings replaced old ones. Records migrated again as technology advanced. Yet the file remained intact, accessible, complete. The case ended as it began in winter, framed by cold air and measured steps. The difference lay in certainty. The ground had testified, the records had spoken, and the law had listened. Nothing more was required.